fellow learners, and welcome to grade 9 social studies, in particular history. My name is Nkombalume Joseph. Our topic today will look at the development of slavery and slave trade. At the end of the lesson, I want you to come and define the two terms. 1, slavery. 2, slave trade. I also want to come and give reasons or motives behind slavery and slave trade. 3, I want us to come and tell me the effects or results of slavery and slave trade on African societies. Now, let's go into the details of today's lesson. Before I talk about slavery and slave trade, I would like us to look at a brief history of slaves. For thousands of years ago, people were bought and sold as slaves. These slaves were made to work for the farm owners, and they were not paid anything. And these slaves did not have the freedom to leave. Those that wanted to escape, they were severely punished by these owners. So before we look at slavery and the slave trade, I want you to look at this picture. We want to find out who these people are and where are they. One may think that these people are at a funeral or at a marketplace. But who are these people? That's very good. These are slaves. These are the people who were taken from Africa to go and work in the sugar plantations and mines in America. But where are they? They are in a ship being carried to America. But look at what they are doing. Look at their faces. Most of them are very worried. Why do you think they are worried? They have been separated from their families. Some of them were about to marry. Some of them were about to be married to other people. But now they have been separated from their families and taken to go and work elsewhere, to places, to unknown places in America. Now, having looked at the people that we'll be talking about, it is important for us now to define the two terms. 1, slavery. 2, slave trade. Now, let us look at these two terms, slavery and slave trade. Now, what is slavery? What is slavery? What is slavery? What is slavery? Slavery is the act of keeping slaves. This is the act of keeping slaves. This refers to the act of keeping slaves. What of slave trade? Who can define for me slave trade? That's a good try. Who else can define slave trade? Good. Slave trade refers to trade in buying and selling of human beings. Or in other words, you can simply say, this is the buying and selling of people to go and work for others elsewhere. This is how we can define slave trade. So we have said slave trade refers to trade in buying and selling of human beings. Slave trade refers to the trade in buying and selling of human beings. Now, before we talk about the motives or the reasons behind slavery and slave trade, it is important for us to look at how this slavery and slave trade developed. How this slavery and slave trade developed. Slavery and slave trade developed as a result of European expansion and colonization of new colonies. Remember that in 1492, the famous explorer Christopher Columbus sailed westwards, where he discovered the West Indies. And European nations such as Portugal and Spain had to fight over the West Indies. So because of the discovery of these new areas in America, the Europeans thought of creating plantations and mines in these areas. And it was discovered that the inhabitants of those areas were not fit to work in these plantations. Hence, they turned their attention to Africa as the source of labor. And because of the increase in demand for people to go and work in these plantations, many people now were brought from Africa to go and work in America. Now, what were the motives or the reasons behind slavery and slave trade? What were the motives or reasons behind slavery and the slave trade? These reasons can be divided into three. These were: 1, social motives or reasons; 2, economic motives. The three, political motives. Political motives. So now, we'll look at each one of them. We'll look at each one of them, that is under social motives, economic motives, and political motives. So what were the reasons under social motives? Now, let us look at the reasons under social motives. The reasons behind slavery and slave trade under social motive. The first one is lack of local labor force. Lack of local labor force. Under lack of local labor force, when these European colonists settled in these areas, the Europeans had to fight with the locals. So many people died due to the wars between the European settlers and the locals. And the other reason under the lack of local labor force is that these Europeans that came from Europe and settled in the new areas came with diseases such as smallpox and measles. And the inhabitants of those areas were not or had no resistance to such diseases. So you can see that because of lack of local labor, the Europeans now tend to Africa, our continent, as the source of labor, or they tend to Africa to come and get people that can work in these plantations and mines which were created in America. The second reason under social motives is the role played by the Spanish priest. The role played by the Spanish priest. Who is this Spanish priest? He was known as Bartolome de las Casas. This Spanish priest spoke against the ill treatment of the local people in America. That also led to the formation of certain laws to bar or to prevent the European colonists to use or to mistreat the local people in America. He, however, had no concern with Africans. In fact, de las Casas suggested that Africans were better workers or suitable workers to go and work in the plantations and the mines in America. So Portugal, Spain, and other European nations turned their attention to Africa as the main source of labor. So they came to Africa to come and capture slaves to go and work in these plantations. So because of the role that the Spanish priest played, that also contributed to the reasons for slavery and slave trade. The third reason under social motive is indentured servant from Europe. Indentured servants from Europe. But the question is, who is an indentured servant? Who is an indentured servant? Who is an indentured servant? We can try to define an indentured servant. Good try. An indentured servant is a person who has signed a contract binding him or her to work for his or her master for a period of 3 to 7 years in return for his or her voyage paid for. When we are talking about this word voyage, a voyage is just a sea journey. So that is what an indentured servant is. So now, let's go back to our chart here. These are Europeans who were taken by their masters from Europe to come and work in the plantations and mines in America. But these indentured servants could not cope with the tropical climate in America. In other words, they were not fit to work as servants in the plantations and in the mines. So what the European colonists did was that they had to turn to Africa because Africans were fit to work in the sugar plantations and mines in America. So under social motives, we have looked at lack of labor force, role played by the Spanish priest, and indentured servants from Europe. Now let us look at the other reasons, and this time let's talk about the economic reasons behind slavery and slave trade. The first one is the role of the Industrial Revolution. The role of the Industrial Revolution. So now, I want someone to define that word, Industrial Revolution. What is Industrial Revolution? That's very good. This is just the change of economy from subsistence to commercial through the use of machines. Remember, in the past, these machines that we use now were not there. And I'm talking about things such as the telescope, the microscope, the steam engines, the magnetic compasses. These are some of the things that were discovered during the 18th century. So the role that the Industrial Revolution played also contributed to the reason behind slavery and slave trade. But the question is how? did Industrial Revolution contribute to slavery and slave trade? Because of the discovery of the things that I've talked about, there was a large-scale manufacture of goods. And this large-scale manufacture of goods also led to the high demand for raw materials. Where were these raw materials? Most of these raw materials were in America. Now, who were fit to go and work in those plantations? These were the Africans. That is why we are saying the role of the Industrial Revolution contributed very much to slavery and the slave trade, because the Spanish, the Portuguese, the English, the Dutch, and French turned their attention to go to Africa to go and capture slaves who were very fit to come and work in the cotton, sugar, and tobacco plantations. So you can see that the role of the Industrial Revolution played a major role behind slavery and the slave trade on the African continent. The second one, under economic motives, we have cheap labor needed for plantations. As I've already talked about the plantations, these were bigger farms that were created by these European colonists. But these European colonists also discovered that the land in America, that is South and North America, were suitable for crops such as sugarcane. Apart from sugarcane, cotton, and tobacco. So they had set up these plantations so that they can grow these crops that we have listed here on the board. Now, the indigenous people were not very fit to grow these crops. So the European colonists decided that the best people to come and work in these big farms or plantations were the Africans, who were able to stand the harsh conditions in America. So because of cheap labor needed for these plantations, hence slavery and the slave trade increased during the 18th and 19th century. The third reason is making money from African slaves. How? And how can this be the reason behind slavery and slave trade? Because of the mines that were created, because of the plantations that were created to grow sugar, tobacco, and cotton, the European colonists decided that the only people that were fit to work were the Africans. So now many Europeans entered or started the business of selling people, and they made a lot of money from these Africans who were obtained from Africa. They now started making huge profits from the Africans who were taken to go and work in America. So because of making money from African slaves that also contributed to the reasons behind slavery and slave trade. The other reason, or the other motives, were three: the political motives. Three, the political motives. And the first reason under political motives, we are talking about the role of Africans in the slave trade. The role of Africans in the slave trade. Here, we are referring particularly to the African chiefs. Because this business was profitable, most of the Africans had to engage in the slave trade, in the business of buying and selling slaves in exchange for guns, gunpowder, beads, and other European goods. So because of the role of the Africans, especially these chiefs, that contributed to the reasons behind slavery and slave trade. But the question that I may ask you is, who were obtained as slaves? Which people were obtained as slaves? So if you were one of these, during that time, you would have been sold as a slave. So yes, criminals were obtained as slaves. Apart from criminals, that's very good. Those tribes that were defeated, so in other words, defeated people, all defeated tribes were also taken as slaves. Apart from defeated tribes, that's very good. So we can say, instead of debt collectors, we would say those people that failed to pay debts. Those people that failed to pay debts were also taken as slaves. So those people that failed to pay debts were also taken as slaves. Apart from this, yes, servants were also taken as slaves. So you can see that the role that these Africans, the Africans played in the slaves, contributed to the reasons behind slavery and slave trade. Last but not the least, the desire for manufactured goods by African chiefs. The desire for manufactured goods by African chiefs. We have said, when these Africans sold slaves, they obtained goods such as guns, beads, gunpowder, and other manufactured goods from the Europeans. So it is that desire to obtain these European goods that led to the increase of slavery and the slave trade on the African continent. So, we have said the reasons behind slavery and the slave trade were: one, social motives. And under social motives, We have lack of local labor force, role played by the Spanish priests, and to be specific, we are talking about Bartolome de las Casas, a Spanish priest. 2, the indentured servants from Europe. 2, economic reasons, the role of the Industrial Revolution, cheap labor needed for plantations, making money from African slaves, under political motives, role of Africans in the slave. And last but not the least, the desire for manufactured goods by African chiefs. These are motives or reasons that led to slavery and slave trade. Now, let us look at the effects of slave trade on the African societies. The effects of slave trade on the African societies. But before we talk about the effects, historians have believed that the underdevelopment of our continent is because of the slave trade that took place some time back in the 18th and 19th centuries. Now, what were the effects of slave trade on the African societies? Before we do that, we need to find out the other term that we can use for this word, effects. In history, when we are talking about effects, we are talking about results. So in other words, what were the results of the slave trade on the African continent? These also can be divided into 3. That is 1, under social effects, 2, economic effects, 3, political effects. Under social effects, we have 1, the depopulation and the destruction. Who can tell me what is depopulation? That's a very good answer. It is just the reducing in number of people in a certain area. So because of the slave trade, many people were killed and their properties were destroyed. So this is one of the social effects of slave trade in Africa. The second one, the introduction of new diseases. What are some of these diseases that were introduced or were brought by these European colonists? We are talking about diseases such as syphilis, measles, and smallpox. And during that time, many of the African women were infected with syphilis, smallpox, and measles. So because of the trade, new diseases were introduced. 3, westernization of Africans. Westernization of Africans. What do we mean by this term, westernization? Because of the interaction that was there between the Africans and the Europeans, most of Africans learned how to read and write. They were able to read and write. And because of the westernization or the interaction between Europeans and Africans, these Africans learned useful skills. Some of them became famous politicians in America. Others, musicians. Others, sportsmen and women. So you can see that the slave trade had a positive impact on the African society because most of them were able, or should I say, they were literate, being able to read and write. Now let's look at the economic effects. What were the economic effects of slave trade? The collapse of the trans-Saharan trade. The collapse of the trans-Saharan trade. When you look at the board here, we have this map of Africa. This map of Africa. Now, what happened during the 18th century was that most of the people engaged in the slave trade along these coastal areas, such as the Slave Coast, the Gold Coast, the Ivory Coast. So they concentrated very much on these coastal areas. The result was that the famous trading center, which was in the interior of Africa at Timbuktu, declined because of slave trade. So we can say that most of the trans-Saharan trade declined because of the trade which was going on along the coastal areas here in Africa. The second reason under economic effects was the introduction of European wealth. When we're looking at the motives behind slave trade, we said these Europeans that came to Africa from Europe, they brought with them goods such as guns, gunpowder, beads, or in other words, let's just say jewelry. They brought these things into Africa. So because of slave trade, Africa had to benefit from the wealth from Europe. So the introduction of wealth was as a result of the slave trade on the African societies. We see people putting on very expensive jewelries. It is as a result of the trade that was between the Europeans and Africa. The third reason under economic was the decline in African crafts. What do we mean when we talk about the African crafts? Before the slave trade, especially in West Africa, there was a large-scale production of cocoa. In East Africa and part of Central Africa, there was a large-scale production of salt and weaving. Now, because of the slave trade, all these activities declined because most of the African chiefs paid much attention to the slave trade than the trade which was there before the slave trade. So we are talking about decline in African crafts. The third reason is under political effects. Under political effects. Under political effects, we have the rise and decline of states. Most of the African states either increased their activities in Africa, but most of them declined. For example, let's go back to our map here. You see that there was a famous area in North Africa. There was a famous area in North Africa that was known for its trade, which was known as Timbuktu. This area declined because most of the people in Africa stopped trading in the goods that they traded with the Arabs and concentrated very much on slave trade. And you'd find that kingdoms such as the Ashanti Kingdom in West Africa and the Dahomey Kingdom in West Africa increased their territories because of slave trade. In Central Africa, we can talk about the Kingdom of Mwata Kazembe and the Kingdom of the Bembas. They had to increase their territory because of the trade. Yes, rise and decline of states was as a result of slave trade. Secondly, we have the increased violence and warfare in African societies, the impact of guns, the increased slavery within Africa. These are other results of the trade on the African continent. So before we come to the end of the lesson, here is an exercise. The first question: what is slavery and slave trade? 2. State reasons behind slavery and slave trade. 3. State 2 results of slave trade on the African society. Here are the answers. Slavery refers to the act of keeping slaves. Slave trade is the trade in buying and selling of human beings. The second question, state 2 reasons behind slavery and slave trade. One of the reasons under social motives is lack of labor. Lack of labor. Under economic reasons is the role of the Industrial Revolution. The role of the Industrial Revolution. 3. Under political reasons is the desire for manufactured goods. Let's go to the last question. State 2 results of the slave trade on the African continent. Under social motives is depopulation and destruction. Under economic effects, it is the collapse of the trans-Saharan trade. We have come to the end of our history lesson for today. From me, Comrade Joseph, it's bye for now.